So, last time we began discussing the study of comparative mythology and specifically the theories about the origin of religion and myth. This, of course, is a huge topic, and I'm going to break it up into several videos. What I should say is that at the time that I started studying comparative mythology, I had very much broken away from my roots, really from my faith. I had a very sort of New Age idea about the existence of God. I had been brought up as a Presbyterian, but during my high school years, I had a lot of issues. There was a lot of hypocrisy and other things that I saw within the church that really led me away, and I had a sort of refusal to deal with organized religion. Although I never stopped really believing in God, but I was sort of agnostic about my own thoughts on things. So I had no idea at that time what comparative mythology was. As I said, I signed up for it. I thought it was going to be an easy A. I was fascinated when we began studying the history of the ideas about religion and where religion may come from. I didn't really have any sort of preconceived problems or, refusal to accept whatever theories the teacher threw at us. I was very open-minded about it. So what is comparative mythology? Well, obviously in the name, you compare the stories, right? These myths, which are stories, religious stories, if you will, from different groups of people all around the world. And you notice the similarities and, of course, the differences. And scholars in the field compare myths using a variety of approaches. The linguistic approach, for example, addresses the language of the myths and how some of these languages may show a common link, which would explain some similarities between the themes of stories from around the world. For example, the Greek sky god Zeus and the Roman sky god Jupiter and the Indian Vedic sky god, oh god, I'm going to pronounce this wrong, Diasis Peter, have linguistically identical names. This suggests that the Greeks, Romans, and Indians originated from a common ancestral culture, and that the names Zeus, Jupiter, Dionysus, and then the Germanic Tu, which gives us the day Tuesday, right, evolved from an older name. And this older name referred to a sky god, or to give the English cognate, a sort of divine father in a Proto-Indo-European religion. Okay. As we discussed last time, you have a professor like Witzel, who uses a similar approach, though he applies some structural and anthropological influences to the model, suggesting that in an ancient past, humans broke off into two different groups due to the continental drift, forming two distinct branches of mythological themes. Other experts like Levi-Strauss look at the structural aspects of myths, and sometimes they'll look at how the plots are similar, how they develop in a similar way, or other times they'll look at sort of these abstract elements and within the story and the way that they interact with each other. So I mean, most obviously there's criticism of cultural mythology. And some people will say, well, they're not really all of these similarities. But when you start reading different myths, you will notice a great many similarities between all of the different stories. I mean, we can even apply these similarities to modern day storytelling with the superhero genre, for example, or the kinds of stories that are told in the opera world. Certainly these types of stories come up over and over again, and there are questions as to why. So the theory that I like the best, and it's certainly the most famous theory, is the psychological approach, right, proposed by Freud and Jung. I'm sure you're all familiar with Freud's ideas about things like the Oedipus complex. And Jung was a researcher who had studied under Freud and worked with Freud, but then he broke off and did different forms of psychoanalysis. And based on his work with his patients discussing dreams, he found that his patients, even patients that were agnostic or atheist and had not been brought up in particularly religious cultures or families, so they didn't know any of the biblical stories that Judeo-Christian culture will give you. Even people that weren't really familiar with these stories would sort of have these characters and themes come up in their dreams. And so, comparing that with all of the other mythologies that Jung had studied over the years, he saw that there was a type of correlation. So, what he suggested was that human beings will have sort of archetypes in our storytelling, and that this points to a sort of collective subconscious. So, what are archetypes? Well, archetypes are constantly reoccurring symbols or motifs in literature, painting, or mythology. Um, this theory that Jung proposed is only possible due to the glaring similarities in mythological stories from all over the world, which again shocked me as a young student because I knew my own culture, but I hadn't considered that there were similarities with other completely different cultures that had no contact with the West. So, for example, I had no idea that China and India and ancient Greece and Mesopotamia all had very similar stories about the creation of human beings from clay, or that most cultures share similar stories about the creation or gift of fire from the divine to humanity. Um, all of these cultures are separated by vast distances and sometimes even time. And yet they still have almost identical ideas about at least some aspects of God. So Jung went on to explain this, that the theory of the collective subconscious is sort of the idea that human beings are born with a sort of universal knowledge of ourselves and our relationship to the divine. And he proposed that in this way we were all connected as a human race on a sort of spiritual level, and that these archetypes that come up over and over again in all of the cultures around the world are a sort of fingerprint of God that has been left on humanity. And as I said, in this period of my life, I wasn't necessarily overly attached to my religious beliefs, so I was very fascinated by this idea of there being some evidence for the supernatural at all. And so I started doing a lot of research. So while I don't agree with all of Jung's ideas, right, because he's sort of a pantheist, this idea that all religions are one religion, which I don't necessarily agree with, I couldn't help notice certain similarities and begin asking the bigger questions. Let's take, for example, the myth of the universal flood or deluge, as it will sometimes be called. Most of us brought up in the Western world are very familiar with the Hebrew story of Noah and the ark, right? We're brought up with this idea of the animals being brought two by two into the ark and the 40 days of the flood. But I think that most people who are not religious just assume that this is, a fun story like, Santa Claus or the Easter Bunny, and they don't think there's any truth to it at all. Um, and a lot of scholars will say, yes, well, there's no evidence that there was a universal flood. Well, that's not exactly true. And I think that it's very surprising that this is, for example, a universal myth. And by universal, I mean that it is a story that has been documented all over the world. There are hundreds of different versions of this story in hundreds of different cultures. And to me, that is incredible. There are versions of this myth in ancient Mesopotamia, and a lot of scholars will say, well, that the story of Noah and the ark was actually copied or at least influenced by the story of Gilgamesh in ancient Mesopotamia. Although I feel that that may be, the Hebrew tradition began with an oral tradition, so we don't know exactly how old Genesis is. I think that the dating of Genesis may be quite off, and it may be that the Hebrew story influenced the Mesopotamian story, or maybe they're just two similar stories because it was actually something that happened. I don't know. But it also comes up in China. China has a story of a universal flood. The Native American Chippewas, which my great-great-grandmother was a Chippewa. So the Native American Chippewa people have a story about a universal flood. The Mayas, the Indians, and when I say Indians, I mean from India. There's a story about a Manu that survived a universal flood. There are so many different versions of this story. It's hard to believe that nothing ever happened, that there was no flood, and that this story has just been made up over and over again. So some scholars have tried to suggest that maybe there was a period of localized flooding, and this kind of localized flooding, because human beings generally live close to water. Maybe because of localized flooding, it just is a coincidence that many cultures have created this kind of story of flooding, and they just happen to be very, very similar. And that is one take. That's a possibility. Although the stories are far too similar, and there are far too many of them to write it off to just coincidence, in my opinion. But there are also other scholars that suggest that during the end of the last ice age, with maybe glacial melting, or that's actually around the same period, 9,000 years ago, when you have the supposed Younger Dryas impact. So this is this idea that the Earth got hit by some sort of meteorite or asteroid, and that this created a flood. And some scholars think that this is what ended the Clovis culture in North America. There are others that would even suggest that the Burckle crater impact, which happened about 5,000 years ago, may have caused a tsunami. And it may be that tsunami that so many different cultures remember. We just don't know. Maybe the story is even older than that. Maybe the story is about a period when the sea levels were lower, when men were still crossing over the Beringa Strait. We don't know. That is what is so fascinating about comparative mythology, is that once you start looking into all of the similarities of these stories that are there, you can't help but to think, well, what don't we know? What are we missing? And why are all of these stories so similar? Maybe there is a logical reason that doesn't involve the supernatural. Maybe. I don't know. But for me, asking these questions just took me on a journey through so much research. And the more research I do, the more I find that this can't just be a coincidence. There is something to it. What that something is really up to the individual. So for the next time, we will look a little bit into Joseph Campbell, because it was too much to talk about both Jung and Campbell in this video. And some people love Campbell, some people hate Campbell. I very much enjoyed that part of the course that I took, so we're definitely going to talk about him. It's undeniable that he had an enormous influence on cinema and storytelling from the 1970s and 80s on. Um, so, with that, have a wonderful week and God bless.